half of our session today, and I welcome our witnesses. In this part of the session, we're interested to explore further some of the challenges to enforcing copyright in relation to AI systems and the technical solutions that help to address those challenges. The first question is this then: which stages of the generative AI life cycle, from data access to outputs, raise the greatest practical challenges for right holders seeking control and remuneration and for developers seeking access to content? In fact, I'm sorry, I should have asked you to introduce yourselves, so if you could do that first, and I'll repeat the question. Professor Colrose.
Thank you. I'm John Collamos. I'm a Professor of Artificial Intelligence at the University of Surrey and one of the co-investigators of the UKRI CoStar National Lab, which was responsible for the recent Time to Act report, which sets out some technical and policy recommendations for the Copyright and AI Challenge. And I'm also Director of Decade, the UKRI Centre for the Decentralised Digital Economy, which brings together researchers across the University of Surrey, Edinburgh and the Digital Catapult. And our work at Decade fed into the ACT report, looks at digital supply chains and how media provenance technologies can support consent and compensation in the creative sector in the age of generative AI.
Mr. Huang?
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to provide evidence to the committee today. My name is Eugene Huang, and I'm the Senior Strategy Advisor and co-founder of a startup named Prorata.ai.
Thank you. And Mr. Connolly?
Thank you very much for the invite here today. It's an honour. Ed Connolly, I'm the Vice President of Engineering at Cloudflare. We're a large internet infrastructure provider, and I look after the teams that provide security and performance products to millions of websites all around the world, and including, I think very relevant today, all of our bot protection identification teams and systems as well.
Thank you. Let me repeat the question. We're interested in which stages of the generative AI life cycle, from data access through to outputs, raise the greatest practical challenges for rights holders seeking control and remuneration, and obviously for developers seeking access to content. Professor Collins.
Thank you. So data is accessed at several stages in the AI life cycle: during the large foundation model training, during model fine-tuning, and also at runtime sometimes when a model might retrieve additional data to help answer a query. And at all of these stages, the challenge for rights holders is really the same. How can they meaningfully control whether their work's used, under what terms, and gain an opportunity to share in the value created by the model output? So today we have standards and tools to deliver this control via kind of blanket opt-in and opt-out indicators. And this is a great start, but in the workshops we ran through the ACT project with creatives, it was very clear that creators wanted much more granular control, particularly the need to specify who may use which works, on what terms and for what purpose. In other words, essentially in an asset-level licensing system. And in ACT, which is an acronym, we summarise this as the 3 Cs, which is control, consent and compensation. So on the developer side, the challenge is, of course, getting access to sufficient scale of content at sufficient quality and knowing where it's come from, so its provenance. And provenance matters because synthetic or low-quality data can harm training, and because without a clear chain of custody, it is difficult to handle content in a rights-respecting way. So obviously this has driven developers to license, make deals with large collections of content. It's an opportunity that's being mirrored by some of the policy initiatives around the Creative Content Exchange to derive value from large cultural heritage collections. But the challenge there is that the creative sector is inherently decentralised. More than half the global creative GVA is from small businesses and freelancers that don't really have practical, low-friction ways to license content at scale. So my sort of evidence today is really that attaching provenance signals to assets can help address the challenges on both sides. They can give creators better agency and give developers scalable access to content that they need, but in a rights-preserving way.
That's helpful. Mr. Huang?
So I agree with what John has said, especially about the three Cs surrounding consent, control, and compensation, especially in terms of a framework that this committee would find helpful in terms of how we understand sort of the tensions that exist between rights holders on one side and technology companies on the other side. And really when it comes down to those 3 Cs, if you sort of think about it, if you're a rights holder, consent, whether your content should be used in training or not, right, fundamentally. control, even if you've given that consent, should your content be used on the output of a generative AI model. And then compensation. I know the previous committee really sort of talked about compensation, but compensation really is one of the crux of the issues that is sort of the debate around AI and content, because ultimately, you sort of think about it, most of the value is being generated on the output side and not the input side. And I know that Ed will most likely talk about some of the work that they're doing on the blocking side. But when it comes to sort of setting up that market mechanism, ultimately there's, I think, a challenge that exists today on what is the value on the input side from the training perspective, as well as on the output side. And how do you actually, if you're a content creator, take advantage of all the incredible value that is being created when it comes to AI and AI generation? Because ultimately, if you're just being paid on the input side, you're not being actually taking advantage of any of the great value that is being created by AI today.
Mr. Connolly?
Building on the previous points, you agree very much on the consent point. I think it's critically important that we find the right ways to let content creators indicate which ways their content is intended to be used, whether it be for AI training, for search, or for traditional search. And we also believe that transparency of the bots and crawlers that are accessing sites and for which purpose they're accessing the sites is critically important also. I think if we have those things in place, we believe that there is a fair marketplace that can exist to compensate content creators correctly, and we certainly feel like we have a solution that works on the data access, data input side, and we believe that also is one of the simpler places to implement such a system. But we also believe that to get that right, we need a level and even playing field, and we think a lot of the AI companies that exist are in a reasonable place to do that, but there are some existing large companies that have some unfair advantages here, and I'll call out Google specifically, who currently combine their traditional search crawler with the crawler that accesses AI, which performs AI summaries of contents and live AI searches as well. And I think we strongly believe that unless we address that problem in some way, we cannot create a fair marketplace for everybody.
Okay, and the follow-on point is this really. We have to weigh, I guess, whether problems could be addressed through technical measures, and we have looked at that in a number of sessions and want to carry on doing so. But where might we need legal, regulatory or market interventions? I might start with you, Mr. Connolly, because the problem you've just described with Google might be one of those.
Right, precisely. I think from a technical framework standpoint, we have the ability, for many companies today, we have the right transparency that we need in place. We have a marketplace framework, we have working end-to-end payment solutions, so we have pretty much an end-to-end solution that works for most people. What we hear from content creators is that they are very interested in participating in the platform because, of course, they want to be remunerated fairly. We hear from lots of AI companies, they're interested in being part of the platform also, but the big hold-up seems to be the elephant in the room is Google here, who effectively have this unfair advantage, and if Google aren't paying, nobody else wants to pay either. So I think that is a problem that we need to find a way to address, and I'm not sure that just leaving it to market forces as they currently are is going to resolve that problem. I think it's an important problem we do need to solve.
So a regulatory problem, a legal approach, yes. A regulatory approach.
Yes, yeah. I believe so.
Yeah, Mr. Fine.
So to give the committee some framework for my comments, ProRata has developed a technology which allows compensation based upon the output that is generated from AI large language model. And so from our perspective, there is technology that works today that we have demonstrated that begins to show how output-based compensation has the ability to work. We're early stages in this, but one of the things that we're very proud of is that we have partnered with 150 rights holders covering over 1,000 media properties. And here in the UK, this includes Sky News, The Guardian, The Independent, The Telegraph, the Daily Mail Group, who is an investor, and then there's a long tail of smaller organizations as well. And sort of our business model is that it's a 50-50 rev share. So 50% of all of our revenues go out pro rata, hence the name, to rights holders when their content is used. Now, the question is sort of, well, what is the challenge, right? And I think that Ed partially mentioned this, which is that there's sort of a cold start problem in some of this, where companies like Google, and full transparency, I am a former Google employee, but I will say that Google is a bad actor in this, as Ed pointed out, because if nobody else wants to, if Google doesn't have to pay for content, nobody else is going to, right? And so, I know that the CMA has recently designated Google as a firm with strategic market status in search, and I applaud that. And I think that their actions when it comes to marrying up their web crawler with sort of AI is an example of how they're unfairly leveraging their position. But on the output side, when it comes to our technology, I think some of the challenges in terms of getting this market started, and I think that your previous panel was alluding to this, is that if you're going to rely upon fair use arguments, especially fair use arguments that are going to try to protect you from liability in terms of how you have used the content, well, of course you're going to say that these technologies can't exist or don't work, because it undermines the argument surrounding how have you trained your content, can you compensate fairly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so from Pro Rata's perspective, yes, there should be market mechanisms, but there should also be a recognition that some of the market mechanisms may actually be market failures today because of how the market has evolved vis-a-vis what we see today from an AI licensing perspective.
Professor Cornwallis.
Well, we see AI and copyright fundamentally as a content supply chain problem. So the technical measure you're asking about is really to address this problem and agree upon a machine-readable, interoperable way to communicate where or who contents come from and what rights are associated with it as it moves around the internet, so from creation to consumption, ultimately to potentially use in AI models. So as soon as we start talking about agreeing on an interoperable way for machines to communicate, we're really talking about a technical standard, and all the better if it's an open technical standard, because that will reduce friction and cost in adoption. And so I'm a strong advocate for open standards as a big part of the solution to the copyright and AI challenge. I'm sure we'll come to talk about examples of this later. There are examples like, for example, C2PA that can be built upon for rights and licensing. But ultimately, technology pieces do exist today to signal rights, can be built on for licensing. The question is definitely a socio-technical one. It's, how can markets and policy drive adoption of these technologies? How to set an expectation, perhaps on content platforms, not to strip away these kinds of signals as they move around the internet in the supply chain. Crucially, to ensure developers respect these granular signals. There's little point going to all this trouble attaching licensing and rights information to content robustly if it's ignored. This could be approached through incentive-based compliance, for example, like a UK AI kite mark was something that was suggested out of our workshops in the ACT reports, backed by a kind of audit mechanism in the spirit of ISO 42001. Focuses on sort of processes and data governance rather than, say, disclosure of training details, which I know was raised in the previous panel as being a concern for some AI developers in general.
Thank you. Let me come to Lord Knight.
Thanks. So I've got a set of questions about technical mechanisms at the training end of the process. So I'll probably focus more on some of you than others. And I'll probably ask stupid questions that require short, stupid answers, or no, clever answers, and we'll go from there. So first of all, in terms of crawling, scraping, TDM, and so on, first of all, it feels like it's a moving target in whether or not something's a bot or someone's a human coming and looking at your website. If we wanted a part of the regulatory regime to differentiate between the two, is it possible, with the moving targets and the sophistication of bots, to differentiate between where they're coming from, whether they're bots or not, what their game is, what their intent is?
I think the way I think about the bot versus human distinction. It's an excellent question, and it's one that we talk about a lot internally. I think if you try and make an abstract classification, there are some things that fall clearly into one camp, others that fall clearly into another, and can be a grey area. The way we like to think about it is more about the kind of intent of the visit. Mm-hmm. And I think if the intent of the visit is to download scraped content for some type of purpose, actually whether that was a bot or a human doing it, in a way the actor is maybe less important than the intent of the visit.
Okay. And then obviously there's been some discussion about robots TXT and machine readable attribution and so on. Technically, there's no reason why we couldn't move to something more sophisticated than robots TXT to differentiate between crawling and scraping and different intent. Is that right?
Correct. Although maybe if I just take a second to talk about some of the limitations with robots.txt, because what robots.txt does is it effectively, if I just focus on Google for a moment, I can tell it to not use this data for training purposes or not use the data for traditional web search purposes, but I'm delegating all authority to Google to make that decision. The actual bot that visits my website is the same bot, irrespective. Right. And that makes a difference, I think, when we talk about transparency and the auditability as a content creator, because I have no idea when I see Googlebot appear in my logs whether or not the intent of that visit was to scrape my content for the purposes of AI training or to scrape that content for the purposes of traditional web. And we believe that is a big issue for the transparency and right holders.
Do you think that solving that particular problem is something that CMA should be grappling as the competition regulator, or do you think that's something that another part of government should be looking at in terms of ensuring that they don't use their market power to have the same bot doing the same thing, that we separate off searching and AI training?
I'm not sure I really know the answer to that question.
You think someone should do it?
I think someone should do it, and it possibly is the CMA and possibly it's others. I think if I would suggest that those interested in the incentives of ensuring copyright holders are fairly compensated for their works, I think the people should drive that forwards.
And with some of these things, if we want to impose, as we might do on transparency, some technical standards that we want people to abide by here in the UK, we've heard from the previous witnesses essentially an assertion that that's not realistic, that everyone will just go somewhere else, that you're kind of wasting your time. This is a global market and it's a global set of technology, and just give in to everything that US tech tells us.
Right. Well, I mean, I fundamentally disagree with that. I think that the world is looking for a solution to this problem right now, not just here. And I think this is an opportunity for us to lead the way and help set an example of what can be done, and potentially work with some other countries in defining it. But I think that people are looking for people to come up with an answer to this. So I think it's an opportunity for us to lead the way and help define a pattern that could be used. And Cloudflare, we are already trying to help to define some of those standards as well.
And the final one for now, before I get, John, your reflections on some of these things, would be that discussion that we had with the previous witnesses about how realistic it was to have granular transparency data recorded in some kind of register automatically as the crawling and scraping takes place. The assertion is that's ridiculous and unrealistic.
Right.
Do you have a view?
But I think some of this comes back to the difference between charging for inputs and charging for outputs, though. And I actually think Eugene is better placed to answer questions about charging for outputs. Yeah. What I can tell you about charging for inputs is it is not significantly complicated to implement a system that does that, because as a bot visiting a website, I can make a check against a purpose. I'm here to crawl content or do whatever it is, and you get a permissions check at that point. So you're not saving the data in your database and trying to attribute it and storing millions and billions of lines of where I am allowed to go and what in data attribution. I think you make a single permissions check as you enter the gate, as it were, into the site. And if you are allowed access, you go in, and if you're not, you don't. So yeah. I don't believe that's a technically complicated thing.
Which sort of takes me, which is where I was going to end up anyway, I guess, but I was going to let John in, but I might as well finish off, about the asset or the unit level approach. So if I'm uploading my song, am I best off trying to get some protection for my song, or am I best off going to a site that has a regime of protection at that level, at that site level?
In terms of so the current solution I think we can have a workable solution in our current state, which is effectively a site level solution. I think an asset level solution is probably a better one that can come in time, but I don't see it as a requirement for us to make progress under the kind of current set of rules.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, I'd love to come in on that, because I think there's been a lot of discussion now about site-based methods, and they're an important part of the puzzle. Essentially, they're an access control mechanism, a voluntary access control mechanism. And of course, if a creator uploads their work to a platform, but then it gets reposted, reshared elsewhere on the internet, that is not going to be the preferences attached to that content aren't going to move with it, and that's why we need asset-level controls to complement the site-level signals. So an asset-level signal requires open standards so that it's interoperable and moves around and can be read across different platforms. CTPA, Content Credentials, is an example of an open standard in this space. It's a provenance standard, so it's a way of describing where content's come from, who made it, what's been done to it, and of course, through that mechanism, you can assign ownership and start talking about layering on AI opt-in or opt-out preferences, and ultimately granular licensing control, as we were proposing. So this is a mechanism that's quite complementary to the access control mechanisms, because in an asset level system, you of course already have access to the asset, and now it's a case of what rights are associated with it and what are the opportunities for compensating the rights holder for that asset if it gets used. And again, layering on open standards on top of things like CTPA, like layering on rights description languages like ODRL, for example, there are already people that are starting to explore this licensing scheme. But of course, that is not as adopted as a site-level scheme, which is in practice.
We're relatively familiar with Creative Commons, where you set different sorts of licensing arrangements according to the content, and all we're talking about here is essentially something very similar for the AI world.
Well, I would say it's more granular in a sense that you can describe who owns a piece of content, and then they can set their own preferences and licensing schemes up on top of that using these other standards, which would enable, for example, remuneration models to be layered on top, rather than a sort of blanket licensing agreement that can be assigned onto content, which would be something like the Creative Commons. But again, it's another piece of the puzzle.
Finally, is that best put into regulation or put into standards, and something that we're creating some kind of market encouragement in terms of what good looks like?
I think standards, as I said, are a major part of the solution. I think industry is the implementers are the right people to lead on the development of standards. We've seen through, for example, Content Credentials, industry partners coming together to create a standard voluntarily and implement that standard at scale. That didn't require any form of regulation, although the adoption of that standard into content platforms, largely around AI labelling, was quite likely encouraged by regulation. So, as I say, I think there are stick approaches, there are carrot approaches. The incentive-led approach would be something along the lines of a kite mark that could be issued around the training of an AI model, that through some audit process it could be demonstrated these markers that move around with assets had been respected. I think that would be another way to do it, which wouldn't necessarily require regulation.
Would you have a preference for regulation or for a preference for the kite mark type approach?
Well, I'm not here to set out policy options. My feeling is I've seen a lot of success in industry-led adoption of open standards through provenance standards. So I would have hope that could be a route that could be similarly followed.
Thank you. Baroness Wheatcroft?
Thank you. Could I just ask you all to say how seriously you think the sort of provenance marking that you were talking about could really work, given that so many small contributors will find it very difficult to check whether their work has been used?
From here as well. Okay, yes. So it's precisely the decentralized nature of open standards, the fact that anyone could write provenance markers into content that makes them attractive for the creative industries where the majority of practitioners are freelancers or SMEs. So it is.
Busy.
Pardon me?
They're busy.
Yes, well, I mean, there are free tools that enable this. There are open source toolkits that enable this, that would enable smaller developers that don't have access to large development teams to implement these standards. I don't see there being a technical barrier there. The sort of barriers that would exist around this are actually more around larger platforms honouring and retaining these signals as they move around through the content supply chain. But again, these signals, provenance signals that are expressed through data that moves around inside the asset, what we call the metadata or supplementary data that moves in the asset, that can be reinforced or made sticky to assets through things like watermarking, where you inject an identifier inside an asset like an image that's invisible but lets you re-identify the content to look up and recover that metadata if it's stripped away. There's a similar technology, fingerprinting. All of these things come together, these three technologies, we call them the three pillars, that make this a practical technology for adoption.
But essentially, you think the obligation or the decision to actually watermark or whatever should be with the creative rather than the onus being with the person, the AI company that's using it.
Well, what we've heard in our workshops is that creators want granular control. So they want to be able to state, you can use my content for this purpose and on these terms, and actually I'd quite like to be paid for that content use as well. So taking the active step to issue those rights and licenses on your content and make them durable so that when they pass into the content supply chain, they can then be hopefully respected by, for example, model trainers, AI developers, is the approach that we would advocate for.
Thank you. Mr. Wang, do you agree with that?
So I do agree with that. I'd like to use an analogy here, which is to the music industry. And I say this coming from a place where Universal Music Group is one of our partners. If you sort of think about how the music industry has evolved, especially sort of new genres like rap and electronic dance music, a lot of it relies upon sampling of other pieces of music and content, right? And as I understand sort of the music licensing regime, if you are a rights holder, you can upload your content to a platform, so like a collective licensing agency or some other organization, who will then sort of take the responsibility of helping you enforce those rights, right? So there's one part of it, as John indicated, which is, there's a responsibility that the content owner has, at least in the music space, to assert their rights associated with a unique composition that they have made. How that assertion of rights then gets prosecuted, right? And if you sort of think about, can there be existing mechanisms that be used to ensure compensation, ensure rights holders get, make sure that their rights are enforced, from the big folks all the way to the small folks, right? Like, it exists in other places, like it exists in music, it exists in video. There's no reason why it shouldn't be able to exist in the AI space.
Might I just push you a little bit on the music issue? Because until the recent licensing agreements with the AI companies, the sort of cases that ever made it to court and eventually did get some sort of compensation for those whose music had been pinched effectively were led by pretty big names.
Yes.
And why do you think that was?
Well, they have the resources to prosecute it, right? The reason why I mentioned sort of like the collective licensing agreement agencies, though, is the recognition that the smaller rights holders, and we've heard this directly from smaller rights holders who have signed up with us, right? It is hard to, they want to create whatever they're creating, right? It's hard for them to sort of think about, okay, how do I manage my rights? How do I go about this, that, and the other? What I will say is that when some of the large AI companies come to august bodies like this and say, we want a blanket exemption, right? Like, that's where I go like, wait. You want a blanket exemption, not for the technical reasons that you are stating, but for a business model reason, right? Like, because ultimately, if one of the critical inputs to your business you can get for quote unquote free, right? I think all of us up here will be telling you that's not free, right? There is a cost associated with that, and each of our perspectives are we're trying to sort of figure out how do we actually bring some version of technology and market mechanisms to bear to actually give rights holders the ability to say, hey, our content is not free. We've put a lot of effort into making that.
Very helpful, thank you. And Mr. Connolly, finally to you.
Well, I mean, not much further to add. I agree with all the kind of the previous points. What we hear from content creators is a desire to have more granular controls, to have those as enforceable mechanisms and make decisions about the fair compensation for their content. So agree with all the previous points.
Right, thank you very much. And just before we move on, could I come back to you, Professor Colonese, and just ask if you could elaborate a little more on your commercial interests?
As with many academics in the AI sphere, I do have a commercial hat, so I do, as I've declared, work with Adobe, but I'm here to speak on my academic behalf today.
Of course, but it would be very helpful to the committee to understand a little bit more about your background and where your knowledge comes from.
Sure, I'm very happy to elaborate. Well, I've been working in the field of artificial intelligence for 25 years, largely.
Your links with Adobe?
I work at Adobe Research in a part-time role, and help.
We can leave it. We can leave it
Yeah,
there.
thank you very much.
We don't need to go into that now.
Thank
you. Thank you. So, Lord Holmes, it's your the next question.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon. Can I ask what kinds of licensing, remuneration, and market infrastructure can facilitate access to creative works for AI development in the UK, whilst ensuring value flows to those rights holders? And if I start with Professor Kolomos, please.
Absolutely. Well, as I say, I think that the best way to view the AI and copyright problem is as a supply chain problem. Provenance standards like CTPA are a way of increasing transparency in the content supply chain. Just like you might want to know how your sausage is made in the supermarket, your food provenance, you'd also like to know, for example, which model made an AI image, which data sets or collections an AI model has been trained on. So provenance data in model inputs, it already opens the possibility of potential revenue sharing models at the collection or the data set level for cases where a model also answers a question by pulling in specific documents or articles, like say from a newspaper publisher. Provenance can show which sources were accessed to answer that query. There could be revenue share agreements made on that data access as well. So I see provenance as being essentially an infrastructure that can be built on. As I was previously explaining, it's essentially an open standard, something like CTPA, that is supported by various technologies to make it sticky, durable to assets. And then once you've established the provenance of an asset, you can start talking about its ownership, as well as its authenticity, actually, which is another great use case for that technology. And then, of course, start talking about defining, using other open standards layered on top, rights and licensing mechanisms. So I see that stack as being a technical stack that is highly applicable to this challenge of copyright and AI.
Thank you. Eugene?
So from Pro Rata's perspective, what we do is that we only use licensed content, right? So, and we're very transparent in terms of our license, which is that we don't pay any upfronts, but we give 50% of our revenue back to content creators based upon how their content is used, at least as how we calculate how their content is used coming out of a AI LLM output. It is different than what most other individuals in this space have been trying to do, which I recognize is slightly challenging, potentially impossible, which is to trace a piece of content all the way through. What we do instead is that we statistically reverse engineer what goes on in the black box of the LLM to give a report which says we believe that 25% of an article from the Daily Mail contributed to this article, to this output. And so from a licensing and market perspective, piggybacking off of what John said, we respect all the signals that a company says that they want to give us in terms of how their content is used or not. We have a blanket compensation scheme, but if we were to engage in a compensation scheme that ended up being unique to a particular publisher, we would adopt that as well. So it's a long way of saying that everything that John has been talking about, we have attempted to implement with our technology.
What level of precision, so what level of, for example, on the percentages, what decimal point could you go to on that, and could you do that irrespective of scale?
Yeah, so right now we, in terms of our technology tests, it is upward north of 98, 99%. And when it comes to scale, right now we have upwards of 50 million documents that we do our attribution against. And so we're a startup. Having come from large companies, I recognize that it is a different scale than very, very large companies, but as I think indicated by those who have signed up and who are backing us, it goes to show that there is faith that we can actually help move the market in this particular way.
Thank you. Ed?
I'll talk about the kind of data input side of this equation, and I'll talk a little bit about not just what could exist, but what does exist today, and tools that my company Cloudflare has built, but also there are other marketplaces that already exist, so it's definitely not just us. I think the foundational pieces on the input side is you need a robust bot identification mechanism, and you need a robust set of tools to give content creators to let them declare the purposes of what their content should be used for, and also the ability to set a price to access that content. And that tooling already exists. And then when AI company bots come to visit sites, they can, before they access the content, they make a check and understand that a payment is required in order to access the content, and they can make a decision about whether or not they want to pay the price to access the content. And should they accept that, they can crawl the content, and Cloudflare, through Cloudflare's marketplace, value can be distributed correctly. And again, there are many other marketplaces that are in existence, and we're actually very supportive of different models existing, because it's hard to know exactly where this is going to go. But as a company, we feel very strongly that it's important that we protect the future of the internet and content creators, not just the large media publishers, but the long tail of creators as well. And having a system that allows everybody, individual contributors alike, to kind of participate in something, we believe is really important. So that's a system that already exists today. And like I said, we have many content creators lined up, ready to work with it, and also LLM companies. But at the risk of repeating myself, there's kind of one blocker in the room that we feel like we need to address with Google.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very clear. And sticking with you, Ed, what role, if any, for government and regulators in spinning up this marketplace for licensing?
Well, I think that there isn't an awful lot needed. I think that we have, like I said, from the tools and technology standpoint, I think we're pretty much there, and we have all participants ready and willing to go. And I'll say it maybe one more time, but I think that the only blocker that we have here is one company in the room. So that's the one thing I think we could do with assistance with. And but other than that, I think everyone seems really keen to participate, to be honest.
Thank you. Eugene, role for government?
I support what Ed has said, which is that that there are sort of market mechanisms that are developing. I think that, as Ed alluded to, right, there is sort of market failure, and what I would probably encourage the committee to do is really look at those places where there is market failure, which is hindering the development of these marketplaces, right? So whether it is, as Ed pointed out, sort of Google's behavior or the behavior of other tech giants who are trying to sort of get away with, okay, we don't have to pay for this because we are relying upon a fair use argument that is outside the jurisdiction of UK copyright law, right? And perhaps it ends up being, if you want to participate in the UK economy, right, you have to sort of abide by, quote unquote, whatever rules and regulations that this body decides, end up being sort of the right balance between supporting innovation as well as supporting content creators.
And on this specific copyright point, are there any other market failures you'd bring to bear for us today?
Not off the top of my head.
No, thank you very much. John?
I see 4 areas really that government and regulators can help. So first of all, endorsing open standards. As I say, I think they're a big part of the solution. Signals that are open, using technology that is free, interoperable to declare the provenance of assets and track their rights through the content ecosystem. I don't think the government should name any particular standard in legislation. I think that's dangerous and it will go out of date very quickly. But I think there could be a role for regulators to give guidance on best practice in industry at any given time. I think the government could help by encouraging durability and respect for these signals that I've mentioned. So content platforms to preserve them. Also talking about maybe encouraging through some sort of kite mark scheme, respect for these signals and recognition when developers have followed these signals. I think some really interesting work being done around this creative content exchange idea in terms of creating a platform for licensing content. I think if that were done through open standards, again, this is sort of leading by example really, then what we would see is that as a blueprint that could shift from large collection owners to the decentralized creative economy, which, as I say, is the majority of the creative economy, and then could be used as a vehicle for small and medium enterprises and freelancers to license their content if done through these sorts of frameworks. I think these are the main areas.
Thank you all very much. It's been very clear. Chair.
Thank you. Okay, fine. I mean, just a last point then, really. You heard the earlier panel, and you probably understand that we're moving through a situation where we're talking to creatives and rights holders, and we're talking to tech companies and AI providers, and getting this different perspective. You know, the last panel we had saying things like 20 to 40% of the future market is dependent on their version of how a copyright market should be. Just how optimistic or otherwise are you about being able to sort this out? Because I think a couple of you or your organisations might be involved in the technical working groups that the government is running. So perhaps it would just be helpful if you could tell us that. How do you feel about this? Is it something that if we grapple with it, we can get to a place where we can, help with the remuneration and certainly support the move forward with AI? Professor Collingworth.
I'm very optimistic, and I think the way to realise that optimism is by moving the argument on from the kind of polarised opt-in, opt-out debate to a place where we recognise that creators, as we've heard, want this granular control over who can use content for what purpose, under what terms, and ultimately remuneration models can be established around that. I think this is not a question of opt-in or opt-out. Actually, both technologies, for robots at text, for access control, and granular licensing technologies, both have a place. And I think if we recognise that there's a landscape of solutions and work with industry and open standards bodies to develop those solutions and incentivise developers to adopt those solutions, then I would be very optimistic that we can find ourselves in a better place.
And it is technically feasible? Yes,
I believe so.
Quite?
Yes. So I want to piggyback off of what Ed said at the very beginning, which is that as I talk to stakeholders around the world, there is a desire for leadership in this space, right? And when I say leadership, it's not the anything goes U.S. style of leadership when it comes to AI and AI regulation, right? Because that doesn't take into account any of the concerns that rights holders have. And this is coming from a perspective of a technology company and a technologist, right? Like I've in talking with rights holders all the time, I fundamentally believe that if we create AI without actually acknowledging the contributions, both historically as well as on an ongoing basis, that content owners can make when it comes to helping AI get better, right? Your previous panel talked about sort of like how technology can actually enable use cases. Well, at one end, if all of a sudden AI just takes over the creative industries, right? Like, what ends up happening then? And so I am optimistic, right? I am optimistic that there can be a solution. And as the professor said, like, if we can move beyond sort of the polarizing, like, yes or no, but actually get to a better place, especially from the vantage points where all of you sit in terms of, like, how do we set up the right market environment, especially when it comes to smart incentives and smart regulation, to let this marketplace thrive. I think that that's the type of leadership that when individuals like myself and individuals like Ed go and talk to stakeholders right now, that leadership is lacking, not just here in the UK, but on a global level.
Thank you. Connolly.
I'm enormously optimistic because I feel like when I look at the situation today, we have AI companies training in the US with no contribution to any creative, to anybody creating anything. And I think if we put in place the new operating model that we've spoken about today with granular controls, not only can we bring AI training to the UK, but we can also compensate people that are creating works. So I think that we can kind of transition two things at the same time. And I think that is reason to be enormously optimistic. And I think technically it's very feasible.
Okay, I think Baroness Fleet, you wanted to come in, do you?
No, it's been covered, thank you.
Okay. Well, that's excellent. It's always good to end on an optimistic note. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vera.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks.